mess of the mommy mystique that is perpetuated in our own families. Judith Warner has published in the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the Boston Globe, Ms. Magazine, New Republic Elle, and Village Voice. She has also authored Hillary Clinton, The Inside Story, You Have the Power, How to Take Back Our Country and Restore Democracy in America with Howard Dean, and co-wrote Grace Maribella's memoir, In and Out of Vote. She is currently the host of the Judith Warner Show on XM Satellite Radio. Ms. Warner's talk will be followed by a question and answer session. We're so pleased to have her talk with us today, so please help me welcome Judith Warner.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here today, and looking forward to the discussion that we'll have after my talk. I'm really eager to hear more about the research that we were just talking about and to hear what you all have to say. I think generationally, I'm kind of in the middle between students and many of the mothers here today, and so I think it would be great to get different generational perspectives on this issue, which is such a rich one. It's incredible for me to think that it's been slightly over a year now since the publication of Perfect Madness. My life has changed so much in this past year, and I think that in some ways the culture of motherhood has started to change too. Perfect Madness came out at a time when a lot of different trends seemed to be coalescing around the subject of motherhood. There were books, TV shows, movies, all of which, with humor or with more seriousness, drew attention to and criticized the crazy way that we look at motherhood today. From Desperate Housewives to the Quarantine Playdate, there was just in the past 18 months or so the beginning of a kind of recognition that things had gotten out of hand, and the beginning of an articulation of a desire to see some kind of change. I'm not going to take credit for that. Perfect Madness was a symptom of the cultural craziness going on in our time, more than it was any kind of cause of this new sort of coming into awareness that I'm describing, although I'd like to think that the book helped play a role in shaping the conversation. I'd always seen the book, even when I was writing it, as a product of the culture. I always felt like I was channeling, and you'll forgive the word, something larger, something outside of myself, something that I was just fortunate enough to be able to tap into and to articulate. I wasn't able to do this because I had any kind of special gift of perception. It was just dumb luck. The luck of having come to America from a place where life was very different. I moved to Washington, D.C. in October of 2000 from France, where I had lived for 5.5 years and where my children were born. France, on and off over the past few years in America, has become a kind of dirty word. But at the time that I started to write the book, it was still for many people a kind of dream. It was certainly a dream for me in the early days when I first got to D.C. and I sleepwalked through life with a baby and a toddler, no child care or even consistent child care or bad child care, living life for the first time in my life in and out of a car, driving to play dates and soccer when my daughter started nursery school. Soccer never quite worked out for us. And those kinds of mommy-toddler events where you sit there with a smile plastered on your face, wondering how you got there and whether you'll ever be able to live it down. It wasn't just that moving to a new country with 2 children was tough. It was that life in America generally was so much harder than our life had been in France. There, I've been able to do pretty much whatever I wanted to do as a mother. Setting up a comfortable family life had been easy. It just happened naturally. Help was affordable, it was accessible, and it was somehow everywhere. At the pediatrician's office, where the doctor answered his own phone. At the community center, where I could get information and referrals for childcare. At the pharmacy, where the pharmacist weighed in on just about anything I asked her about, and even things I didn't ask her about. No one expected me to be a perfect, all-knowing, all-responsible, self-sufficient mother. I never felt alone as a mother. It never even dawned on me that anyone might feel that way. Here, it was a whole different ballgame. Life was expensive and competitive and tough. The pressure to do everything and to do it just right was incredible. I barely moved into my new house when people started lecturing me on the importance of getting into the right preschool. I wanted to work, but babysitters earned more per hour than I did as a writer. Trips to the pediatrician's office were like being stuck on the beltway in rush hour traffic. The pressure and the competition and the expense and the stress that just never seemed to give up. This all seemed not just nerve-wracking, but absurd and unnecessary to me. But as we settled in further and my kids got older and we all got used to life in America again, it stopped seeming so strange. It just became normal life. In the many long stretches of time that I spent then without childcare, I started hanging out a lot on the preschool playground, spending a lot of time with other stay-at-home moms. And the stories that they told me about their husbands, their relationships, their resentments, and sometimes their rage when they found themselves being snubbed by women who formerly would have been their colleagues, just blew my mind. Not because I couldn't relate to what they were saying or recognize myself in their words, because increasingly I could, but because hearing them talk, I became more and more convinced that the problems that I was having in adapting to motherhood in America weren't my problems alone. The stress and the anxiety and the pressure to be perfect, they weren't just my issues alone. They were social issues. It was all very puzzling to me. I spent nearly 6 years in France reveling in what I believed was American women's superiority. With our straightforwardness, and our confidence, and our muscles, and our hard-fought gender-neutral place in the workplace and in society, I thought we were much more evolved than our French counterparts with their cigarette-induced skinniness and their lifelong need to seduce. But now that I was back in the land of G.I. Jane, I felt like I'd walked through the pages of the feminine mystique. The pressures, the depression, the self-criticism, and the self-doubt that I've heard from the moms around me, working and not, it reminded me so much of the problem that has no name that Betty Friedan had written about back in 1963. Our outer worlds had changed so much in the 40-odd years since the pre-feminist 1960s, but our inner worlds as mothers, not so much. Before moving to Washington, it never dawned upon me that not having an easel in my house was tantamount to neglect, nor that I would one day find myself in the supermarket making my 50-pound daughter push an 80-pound grocery cart and upper body strengthening exercise recommended by her OT, and I was shouting at her as she trailed behind me, "You're not trying, you've got to get motivated, you've got to focus your mind on pushing that cart." It wasn't just the world around me that I was feeling strange in Washington, it was me, trying to keep up, trying to do things the way I thought they were supposed to be done, trying to overcome, in a sense, my own and my children's better tendencies. I was turning into someone I didn't like very much. Someone who reminded me of a much younger self, of the girl, the young woman, who strove to be perfect and was never satisfied, who sat in high school surrounded by other perfect wannabes who folded their arms into a praying mantis position, digging their elbows into their stomachs to quell the butterflies there as they waited for their graded papers to be handed out. I became this person again as I filled out the parent questionnaire during my older daughter's play date at one local private school and covered both sides of the form in teeny tiny writing, trying to cram the entirety of my daughter's life, of our lives, of our very selves, onto one piece of paper. I scribbled on after time was up, just as I had in high school, the same sort of frenzy, as though with the overwhelming force of this bombardment of words, with the magical act of graphomania, I could write my daughter's future and take away all my worries and fears for her and make everything come out okay. We all have our own worries and our own kinds of particular magical weapons with which we think we can get some kind of control over our world and make things turn out all right. For some mothers, it's scheduling. You get those color-coded activity slots stacked up just right, and maybe for once, things won't seem like they're about to come apart. For some, it's therapy. This therapy and that therapy and on until some therapy finally will provide the silver bullet that will make the most intractable seeming problems go away. For some, it's school volunteering, proving that you're a good enough person. For some, it's not volunteering, striking a defiant posture that shows that you and your family will resolutely rise above all the madness that rages on around you. It doesn't matter what it is. Baking the most perfect cookies, hunting down the last tiny gram of trans fat. Many, many of us, in one way or another in this generation, have fallen prey to the trap of trying to control everything and create a perfect world for our children through our mothering. And we've made ourselves miserable in the process. We haven't made our kids any happier or healthier or trouble-free. On the contrary, many of us are well on the way to making them as crazy as we are. But all too often we're blind to the harm we do. And our obsessive focus on the inner workings of our children's lives and our own lives shuts down the possibility of imagining a life that could be different. I wrote Perfect Madness because the memory of a different kind of life was yourself go out of focus, losing sight of the husband, of your marriage, of your dreams. We tend to accept all of these things as the necessary outgrowth of life with children, with young children in particular, but they don't have to be. Because the things that make our lives difficult as mothers are not a natural outgrowth of motherhood. They're an outgrowth of motherhood in our culture. And they're an outgrowth, too, of our generation, my generation, own particular take on politics, our collective psychology, and our collective history as women at a particular point in time in American society. Many people hate it when I start talking about changes to American society, but other people's eyes just light up, and I think this is a sympathetic crowd, so I'm going to enjoy doing it today. Because changing society on many levels, from the individual and personal on up to political, is what Perfect Atlas is really about. In the book, I make a number of specific suggestions for changing our society. They include a call for incentives like tax subsidies to encourage corporations to adopt family-friendly policies, government-mandated child care standards and quality controls, flexible, affordable, locally available, high-quality daycare, including part-time daycare, new initiatives to make it possible for mothers and fathers to work part-time, general measures to alleviate the terrible economic pressures weighing down on the middle class, including progressive tax policies to transfer our nation's wealth back to the middle class. The point of all this is not that government can take our inner turmoil away, but that with the proper kind of support, women will no longer have to feel like the responsibility for absolutely everything rests on their shoulders alone. With the proper kind of empowerment, real empowerment of the sort that comes from acting upon your world and changing it to suit your needs, women will no longer have to behave like control freaks in order to feel like they have their lives even minimally under control. Mothers today micromanage, controlling the little details of their lives like mad, because it's all they feel like they really can't control. And because they can't manage their lives, because many women's lives are simply unmanageable, they start to go a little bit nuts with stress and self-criticism and frustration. By trying to manage the unmanageable, I mean trying to balance an impossibly long work week against impossibly high standards of motherhood. Or trying to save money for college when you can barely make ends meet. Or, in many big cities like Washington, D.C., trying to create the perfect world for your child while dealing with the fact that your local public school is woefully inadequate and there's nothing, no amount of supplementary art lessons or music or 5 a.m. swim meets that's going to change that basic fact. The fact is, in America today, we talk a lot about family values, but we do nothing to make family life more livable and sane. There are virtually no structures in place that can make parents feel like they can sit back, let go, and know that their children are and basically will be okay. There are no structures or policies in place to help families achieve balance. There are no real policies to support the middle class. There's virtually no investment in or creative thinking about workable solutions that might relieve the day-to-day psychological and financial burdens weighing down now on families and on mothers in particular. And the result is that in America today, many mothers feel like they have no one to rely on but themselves, and to a great extent they're right. And that is the source of the mommy madness that we read so much about and live out every day. There's an effect on this I'd like to talk about a bit today, and that's the spiritual void that I think accompanies the frenzy of harried and worried family life in our time. In the book, I use the word religion a lot, referring not to religion as we normally think of it, but up to the making into religion of ideas or practices, of ways of being or doing things that's so uniquely American. Think about the way some people talk about their stroller choices, you know what I mean. And the problem is that the making into religion of our beliefs, of our very material beliefs about success in particular, and the way we do things as parents to ensure our children's success in every possible domain, have to a large extent supplanted other forms of belief or spirituality. Lost in this mad race for success is belief in the human spirit, the preciousness of each individual, of the beauty within each individual child, whether or not he or she has the ability to get into Harvard Law School. Lost is the sense of the sobriety of family time, by which I mean safe, quiet, at-home downtime, which has been supplanted by the religion of ostensible togetherness, which consists in the suburbs of being packed together in the minivan with a DVD player on, while shuttling back and forth between soccer and vision training and taekwondo. Lost, too, in the way that we parent today in the excessive, choking, child-centeredness so many of us practice is the sacredness of parental responsibility, what blessing of a skin knee author Wendy Noble has called the blessing for a child of having someone to look up to. We're so caught up so much of the time in blindly doing what is ostensibly right for our children that we often lose sight of what is simply right. And that means sometimes not letting our children potentiate each and every last skill, not letting them be true to each and every last authentic desire and sentiment they have. Sometimes it means not letting them be the very, very best soccer player or violin player that they can be, because they just have to take some time off to sit down and have tea with grandma. Our lives become so complicated when we must constantly be creating perfect kids. Sometimes we lose the most basic sense of our own centeredness. We lose the ability to listen to the quiet of our souls, and the soul of our family can go silent. As a woman in St. Louis who I interviewed for the book put it, it's so hard now that we have so much money and opportunity, we're having to remind ourselves of what things we like to do as a family. There's another aspect of all this I'd like to talk about that's come to my attention a lot since the book came out, and that's about the notion of what is or should be real or realistic for women and for young women in particular. The question got a lot of attention last fall when the New York Times published a front-page story which reported that many young women at Ivy League colleges, most notably Yale, were saying that they were planning to halt or scale down their careers once they became mothers. I have a talk show now on XM Satellite Radio, and after the story ran, we put together a show around the article, which I titled in my mind, "Are Ivy League Schools Turning into Places to Find a Rich Husband?" I interviewed the author of the piece, Louis' story, Joan Williams, whose book, Unbending Gender, many of you probably know, a Yale student, and Cynthia Russett, a history professor, who'd been quoted in the story saying that young women were turning realistic. What was most interesting about doing these interviews wasn't just seeing to what extent the story was lacking in real insight. What was interesting was the notion of what was real or realistic. The older women who I interviewed from the show said the younger women were entirely unrealistic. They imagined being able to plan out their lives in a sort of fairy tale way that had no recognition of the fact that many things like divorce or a husband's job loss or the rising cost of living could make their life plans fragile and untenable. The professor, Cynthia Russett, noted that she'd been quoted out of context when she said that young women were turning realistic, which sounded approving of the trend. The quote, she said, was really part of a larger point, which was that, given the fact that our country still has no structures in place to support families with two working parents, it was realistic to anticipate that trying to balance work and family life could be all but impossible. What's interesting here, as far as the notion of reality is concerned, is the way that the quote was taken out of context. Professor Russett was pointing to an objectively existing, and in her mind unfortunate, social and political reality. Her quote in the context of the story was made to sound like she was reinforcing a notion of the reality of motherhood, essentially that by its very nature, motherhood is incompatible with careers. I want to draw attention to this because it's a kind of conceptual and linguistic slippage that's happening all the time now in America on the subject of motherhood. People are turning their eyes away from the social and economic realities of family life, things that could be changed, and are converting them in their minds into grand notions about the unchangeable realities of motherhood. Things like how passionately mothers love their children and their children love and need them, and how these passions and demands are so strong that they make work and motherhood incompatible. It's true that the power of the mother-child bond is unique and overwhelming. It's true, too, that in households where the parents are working over 100 hours a week, parenthood and work are already compatible. But is our task now to embrace and accept this incompatibility? Or is it to change society so that families don't need parents working over 100 hours a week to get by? There's a related issue that's come up a lot in talks that I've been in ever since the book came out, which is what to teach girls and young women. There was one dinner that I went to in Bethesda outside Washington, where a woman stood up and said how great she thought it was now that we were mothering in this era, as opposed to, let's say, in the 1970s or early 80s, when we had moved further away from the feminist movement and all of its dictates and demands, and could now tell our daughters the truth, which was that once they became mothers, they would not be able Never let anybody hold you down, limit you, or put you in your place because you're a woman. This was sort of an abstraction to us. There were no boys there to do it, although we've heard of things like that happening in other places. And we were at a time when we didn't really consciously suffer from sexism that we'd read about happening in other places. We were a transitional generation, close enough to the 1970s to be aware of all that had changed for women, but far enough along to have become complacent. In fact, a woman who I'd been in class with reminded me about a year ago about how Ellen Futter, who was then president of Barnard College, came to talk to us about our futures. It was about 1982. She told us about the responsibilities that came with an education like ours, and how we had to go on in life to do great things and remember the importance of what we were doing and stand up for what we had learned and carry the flag forward. One woman stood and she said, "What if we just want to be wives and mothers?" This was a laugh line for us then. It was so far from what we ever thought would be part of our experience. Ellen Futter warned us against it. She said that with our education, we had to work, we had to change the world, we had to remember that things were still tough for women, but it was all still an abstraction to us. We didn't think about our lives really in this larger social context. Our insouciance now tells me how much we took for granted. We never thought that we were going to face any kinds of either-or choices in life. We were sure that we could do anything we wanted to do. And even if we encountered roadblocks down the line, I'm very, very glad to have come at an age at a time when we were able to have dreams of absolutely anything being possible for us. I don't understand the tendency that some people have now to think that it's a good idea to replace a so-called reality that's so far from ideal for so many women today. I don't understand why anyone would think it was a good thing to limit girls' dreams and desires. I think it's a horrible thing to cut girls off at the knees. When I think about my own daughters and the difficulties that they may face later in life, it's clear to me that the answer to the challenges that lie ahead is not to capitulate, but to fight for change. As I'm sure you all know, Betty Friedan died recently, and her death was an occasion for me to think about her life and her legacy, and also to ponder some painful questions. I wondered, was I living up to my own feminist principles in my life? Was I doing anything enough to try to help carry on Betty Friedan's legacy? Reading her memoir let me off the hook a little bit in my personal life, because what I realized from reading her memoir and thinking about, for example, Gloria Steinem's life, is that we all do the best that we can do. We try. We're not perfectly consistent. Things don't happen in a seamless way, but we try. Maybe in my house, the household tasks are not divided equally, but maybe it's not that bad either. With my husband and I, sometimes it's an argument about who really has the power. He believes that it really isn't about power, that with us it's about personality. And though I've always resisted that explanation, I think that there may be some truth to it. And the fact that there could be some truth to it means, in a sense, that we really have come a long way. That one may be hard to figure out for the long term, but a bigger question, and that troubled me more, has stayed with me. What kind of model am I for my daughters? And generally, what kind of example is my generation setting for our daughters? And there I fear we're really not doing very well. Leaving aside the issue of household tasks and how badly we know, generationally and globally in this culture, they're divided, and leaving aside too the question of stay-at-home versus working motherhood, which is a debate that we may or may not want to get into, and which I think often is pointless when thought of as a debate. If we think just about how we're helping or not helping our daughters, in terms of how they value themselves as people, in terms of the values that they carry generally, in terms of how they see and understand themselves, I think we've got some serious work to do. If you look at the enduring prevalence of eating disorders, the fact that dieting has spread to the point where girls in my daughter's class were starting to talk about it when they were in first grade, I think that we failed in some kind of very serious way. When you think about perfectionism, the scourge of our generation, which is playing itself out again in the younger generation, and is showing up now in very, very young girls who are very hard on themselves. When you think about the extent to which so many of us buy into our soulless culture of success, which leaves women questioning themselves and their value when they step off the performance track and then be creative if they stay home with their kids, driving their kids crazy in the process. There's something that's going wrong. This culture that can be so poisonous for both men and women, I think strikes women in a particularly virulent way. And I don't think that we're calling it into question deeply enough. I think that we're still living in it and enacting it and transmitting it to the next generation. I think that if we're going to model greater strength and resilience for our daughters, we need to model a greater degree of contentment and peace with ourselves. Being at peace with ourselves means being able to accept ourselves as we are and find happiness within perfection. The other night I was at a book discussion and there was a woman who was talking about her daughter. The woman speaking was blonde and thin and very pretty, the kind of look that plays into all of my insecurities. And she was talking about having a daughter who was heavy. And I thought, oh no, how's this going to go? But she said that she had gone to art museums with her daughter and had made a point of stopping to look at the paintings of Rubenesque bodies and say, look, in other centuries, we didn't value these thick, skinny bodies. There were other ideas of what beauty could be. This is a recent phenomenon. It's not universal. Or when she saw her daughter's stick, skinny friends, she would take her aside and joke and say, well, if a strong wind comes along, they're not going to stand up too well. And I thought, this woman is taking extra steps. She's going beyond the platitudes we so often use to talk about how we're all different and we all should be valued for what we look like. Taking that extra step to meet her daughter where she is and really embrace who she is. And being able to do that really means being able to embrace who we are and stand up for who we are. And be brave enough to define who we are and follow through on it. There are so many toxins in our culture, I think, right now, facing girls and young women. Inner strength, giving our daughters inner strength, is one way that I think that we can help them combat that. But individual solutions are not enough. If we care about Betty Friedan's legacy, if we want to carry it on, we have to do more. About 10 years after The Feminine Mystique was published, Betty Friedan warned that if we didn't change the larger structures of our society, then the promises of feminism could well prove to be, as she said, all talk. 30 years later, we still haven't done it. And for many women who don't have real choices in facing how to set up their lives and how to make their work lives and their family lives work and be sane, then feminism has proven to be largely talk. And this is the challenge that we all have to carry forward now. It isn't enough to think about your own life. It isn't enough to think about and plan for and act upon your own choices. If you want to carry on Friedan's legacy, the work of a woman who, with other like-minded women, changed the world and gave us this world that we inherited and which many of us have taken for granted, you have to work to make sure that all women in America have choices, the many and not the privileged few. You have to raise your voices, to force our political leaders to put families on the national agenda and stick up for family values, real family values, not falsely moralistic ones that have to do with reducing stress on families and letting families have a better quality of life. I believe that the rising generation of young women is well positioned to do this because you're not quite as complacent as we were. You're not quite as individualistic and conservative as we were coming of age in the 1980s. Your generation has seen and registered the failures of our society to resolve the work-family dilemma. Your generation is aware of the economic constraints of coming of age, striking out on your own, and starting a family now. I read a lot about the anxiety in your generation and of a certain breaking down that's happening among many young adults right now. And I want to say, don't give in to these limitations. Don't internalize the limits of our society and make them your own. Let them radicalize you. Let them make you indignant. Let them make you bold and brave. Follow your dreams, regardless of whether or not people tell you that you're going to fizzle. Demand workplace change. Demand government change. organize and write letters and speak out and fight. And maybe then you can complete the revolution that many of